Captain, you have an incoming call from one of your viewers.
What is up, guys? Captain X Creed here. I'm doing this crazy video today. I don't know why I thought about this, but I did. So my friend Life of Lewis, he does YouTube still. I kind of dropped out of the YouTube life. I'm just kind of done doing a lot of other things now. Been busy, been working. But my friend Life of Lewis, he still does YouTube, and his YouTube channel is Life of Lewis. And he wants to get to like 1.1 thousand, I think, and he's only a little bit away. So I'm doing this video. I'm taking 2 hours out of my day to do this for him. So if you just take 2 seconds out of yours and just hit that subscribe button, the link will be in the description for him. Just click the name and then go to his channel. Just hit the little subscribe button, and you might even like his videos. But just to do it for him, just to help him out, because I know that when I was first starting, I really wanted subscribers. You know, it was hard to do, it was hard to get, and I know it'd mean a lot to him. So if you guys would just do that for me, that'd mean a lot to me and mean a lot to him. And so we're gonna get started in this video now. So I actually got this little app that I found, and every time you hit it, it counts. So what I'm gonna do is, as I'm saying it, oh, I didn't even say what I'm doing. I'm saying Life of Lewis for 2 hours straight, and so every single time I say Life of Lewis, I'm gonna click the button just so it kind of adds the number, and I'll show you guys at the end. And I don't know if you guys have heard of Mr. Beast, but he's basically the person that started all this. He's basically yeah, he's the person that started all this. He's be doing, you know, 24-hour challenge, like spending 24 hours like underwater, or saying PewDiePie 100,000 times. Like, he just does ridiculous stuff. So this is kind of the inspiration behind this, the reason why I'm doing this for my friend Lewis. And I got my iPad right here, so I'm gonna draw. I like to draw, so I'm gonna draw on here while I'm doing this. I hate that. This is literally, I hate this so much. The sound of this. If anybody has that as a ringtone, you need to change it. Okay, so I don't know if you guys can see it right now. It's not really focusing. But it's for 2 hours. So I'm gonna start that, and then I'm gonna start hitting the button, and I'm gonna be doing Life of Lewis, or saying Life of Lewis. So I'm gonna hit it, and I'm gonna go to the app, which is right there. So alright, I'm about to start this. It's 8:07 right now, or 8:08. I'm gonna be starting. Okay. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, 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 life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, 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 life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Come on. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, life life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, life Lewis, life of 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 life, life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Lewis.
I think the snore.
Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis,
Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis,
life of Lewis,
life of Lewis,
life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis,
life of Lewis, life of Lewis,
life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis.
Try again. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of
Lewis,
Lewis,
life of Lewis, life of Lewis, Lewis, life of 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 Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Lewis, Life 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
I think you should jump on the trampoline
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life
from the
Lewis,
roof and say Life Lewis,
Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
You get more people, I guarantee you.
Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis.
Who wants to see Creed jump off?
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Who wants to see Creed jump off
Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
the house singing Life Lewis?
Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
I bet you. You'll get more people.
Life Lewis.
Jump off the house
Life Lewis,
on the trampoline.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
And
Life
say
Lewis,
Life
Life
Lewis.
Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. 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 Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Oh, it's not live?
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis.
But I could take the camera.
Life Lewis, Life
You could
Lewis,
jump
Life
on the
Lewis,
trampoline
Life Lewis, Life
from the
Lewis.
roof.
Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis.
He's
Life
gonna.
Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
You're gonna be
Life
dreaming
Lewis.
Life of Lewis.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis,
Really?
Life Lewis,
1
Life Lewis.
hour in?
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life
1
Lewis,
hour
Life Lewis,
in.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Life of
Lewis,
Lewis.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Gotta have a little beat.
Life
Go
Lewis,
little.
Life Lewis, Life
Life of
Lewis, Life
Lewis,
Lewis, Life
Life of
Lewis,
Lewis.
Life Lewis, Life
Life
Lewis,
of
Life
Lewis.
Lewis, Life Lewis.
1 hour to go?
Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis,
Okay, I guess I gotta go.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Jump off the house.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis,
Sing
Life
Life
Lewis,
Lewis.
Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Somebody help him.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis.
Subscribe. Help my
Life
son.
Lewis, Life Lewis.
Life of Lewis.
Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 dang, life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis,
2018.
life of Lewis,
It's gonna be 2019.
life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life
What
of
if you
Lewis,
need the
life of Lewis,
restroom?
life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis,
Help my
life of
son.
Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of
He
Lewis,
has Life of Lewis on his mind.
life of Lewis, life of
He
Lewis,
needs
life of
help.
Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis,
Please
life of Lewis,
subscribe.
life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis,
2018.
life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis,
It's gonna be Christmas soon.
life of Lewis, life of
By
Lewis,
the
life
time
of
we
Lewis,
stop saying Life of Lewis.
life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis,
Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis.
life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of L Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. 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 Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Lewis, Life 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life of 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis,
Life
Life
of
Lewis, Life 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 Lewis,
That's cool.
Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life Lewis, Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis, Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life 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 Lewis, Lewis, Life 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 Lewis, Lewis, Life 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 of 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 Lewis, Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. This is Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis. Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis, Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis, Life 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Life Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Lewis. Life Lewis, 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 Lewis, Life Lewis, Lewis, Life of 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 Lewis. Dang. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of L Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. life of Lewis, 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 watch his life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Lewis, life of 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 Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 whoa, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis, life of Lewis. What's life of Lewis, 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 life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of L life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Alright, it's been 2 hours. Life of Lewis, 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 Life of Lewis. Alright guys, 10,000 times I said, whoops, I said Life of Lewis 10,000 times. I use this little counting app so I'll just add a new one just to kind of show you. Whoa, can I focus? Just kind of show you, and you can name it whatever, and basically you go into it, and every time you press it, it'll add one. So every time I was saying Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, Life of Lewis, I would just add one. And what's crazy is I hit 10,000 like almost exactly at 2 hours. Like that was, I don't know how that happened. That was actually insane. I was not expecting that to happen. And the thing that I drew, maybe if you're wondering like what I was drawing, because I did finish it. I actually finished it a little back. But I was drawing this. It says Life of Lewis. But in every letter, it's a bunch of little mini things that say Life of Lewis. So that's what I was drawing. Just kind of going. Alright, well, I am going to stand up. Oh, and my battery's about to die too. That was perfect timing. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. And I hope you go subscribe to my buddy Lewis. He really wants subscribers, and he's almost at his goal. It's 1.1k. So because you guys, please go subscribe to him. It only takes a couple of seconds. Just hit that subscribe button, go and link in the description, just press the little box, the little drop box will open, and just hit the little thing, and go to his channel and subscribe, guys. But thank you so much. I know you didn't watch this entire video, because I would not watch this entire video. But I did say Life of Lewis 10,000 times, which is actually insane. For 2 hours straight, just did nothing but said Life of Lewis, and that's what I did. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys can go subscribe, like this video, and if you're not already subscribed to me, I don't really do YouTube anymore, but I might every now and then do a video like this. I I might even do sometime in the future watching every video of Life of Lewis, and I don't know how long that'll take, but I might just watch every single one of his videos just to get on some subscribers, guys. But thanks so much for watching. Like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, peace out.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face, tell me that you love me.